everybody. Welcome to episode 4 of the Canary. We're excited to see you all again, and we have a very interesting and hot topic for y'all this time, as well as our second guest.
Yes, today we are tackling emotional intelligence and how that impacts hiring and positions in the workforce. And please welcome our guest, Deanne Marlowe. She
Hello.
is a some partially retired HR executive from companies like Hilldale. We met her when she was at Cummins in Columbus, Indiana, and she brings a wealth of HR experience.
Hello.
Mhm. So I think it goes without saying that the job hunting process can be kind of rough, especially nowadays, but job hunting as an autistic person tends to be a unique level of nightmare for so many different reasons. But one of them is that there are a lot of unstated rules about how you're supposed to act in like the day-to-day functioning of the workplace that can often be considered but not necessarily communicated or understood in the greatest way in the job description. Now, I first want to preface this by saying it was really good that we split from having a unilateral understanding of what intelligence is and just the IQ measurements and being able to split off into measuring more different kinds of intelligence, emotional intelligence, in fact, being one of them. We're not saying that this is a bad thing. It is, in fact, a very good thing. However, I think we also need to get more granular on this measurement as well, because I think what a lot of people are saying when they mean they want folks that are emotionally intelligent kind of get biased by a lot of the ways that it's typically presented, or maybe it's not as much of a relevance to the actual job description at all, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. I think you're right. It's probably a bit elusive in the job description from time to time. They talk about very specific skills, and then this, and emotional intelligence is a bucket of what? What do they mean by that?
Yeah, it's like, it's the sort of thing where it's just like, okay, this sounds good. We'd like to have this, but then they're not necessarily clear on what that means. And I think a lot of the time they say emotional intelligence when what they really mean is emotional maturity. And those are absolutely not the same thing because you could be emotionally intelligent, you could be aware of people's emotions, and then use that knowledge to like manipulate people. Whereas there
Sure.
may be cases where you can't always tell what people are feeling. That's definitely a legitimate experience from the autistic side of things. But when you actually do click and understand, it just kind of knocks you over like a tidal wave. It's like, oh my God, you're experiencing so much distress. I'm so sorry. I didn't realize.
Well, I think too, it's interesting when you think about what do they mean by emotional intelligence or emotional maturity. I think it's having empathy and understanding, and I think acknowledging the challenge. So for someone who's neurodivergent, I think even emotional intelligence can be talking about that in an interview.
Hmm.
Or if you've had, even if you're neurodivergent, or any person, every person thinks and works differently. We all have different types and different styles and different approaches. And I love, we've used Myers-Briggs and different things over the years, other tools to assess, personality. A lot of that comes back to self-awareness. How do I show up? And as a neurodivergent person, understanding how you show up and being able to talk to that in an interview. Here's how I
Hmm.
show up. Here's also how I can contribute. Here's how I can add value. Here's how I can work with others. But it
Hmm.
may not be as you might have expected, if that makes sense. Going back to kind of the Myers-Briggs, I hired a person years ago, and I'm an ENTJ in Myers-Briggs. And I didn't hire her intentionally, but I thought we had a lot of similar things. I thought she was an ENTJ. Well, she turned out to be an ENTP. And a P does this when they're getting to a result. The J does this. So she's working in this space and I'm working this way. And I'm thinking, oh Lord, I hired the wrong person. And then we did Myers-Briggs and it was like all of a sudden it's like, oh, you just think differently than I do. And what we did on a big project was we're going to have touch points here and here. What you do in between those touch points, I don't really want to see. It's like the toy room when kids go, I just need to shut the door and let you do your thing because you're going to do it in a way that's so different from how I would do it. But you're going to get to a great outcome. And so I think, she wasn't necessarily neurodivergent, but she showed up differently than I did. And I think someone that's neurodivergent shows up differently. And it actually isn't reserved just for someone who's neurodivergent. We all show up a little bit differently. Pam and I work differently on things. Rob and I work differently on things. Having maturity means understanding how you show up and having the ability to talk to that and explain, here's how I work. Here's how I add value, but it may not be exactly as you've expected. And with neurodivergent, a lot of people haven't had that experience with someone who's neurodivergent, so they don't even know. They don't even know what questions to ask.
Deanne, you have made some great points here, and I wanted to add that in terms of showing up differently, since I'm an ENTJ too, Deanne, so
and I'm somewhere in between an INFP and an INFJ. It's sort of fluctuated a little bit as I've taken the tests over the years. So it's just like, I'm somebody who the best way I can describe my thought process is that I get a gut feeling about how something should be, and then I catch up to the logic that's been going on in the back of my brain later.
Yeah, so as a project manager, I see a lot of value in having different personality types and different types of workers in a project if you're going to come to the best solutions. And sometimes I think it's, since I try to provide the sort of manager perspective, it's incumbent upon us to learn how different styles show up, including how neurodivergent styles show up. And specifically on the empathy piece, when we were preparing for this episode, I thought about the ways that we sometimes think that people who are neurodivergent don't show empathy in the same way. And I had a very recent thing actually this week where this showed up the way that I've seen in the workplace from autistic employees that I've worked with, which is sometimes compassionate behavior is shown by offering technical assistance rather than emotional support. They see that offering of technical assistance sometimes as a way of showing that empathy that I think you could benefit from this. And I was actually working on a presentation I'm giving next week, and I was doing a run through, and there was a staff member that was the one who was finding all the little things that needed to be QC'd in my presentation, which was a super big help for me offering that assistance, because right after the run through, I went and cleaned up my presentation, and now I feel much better about it for next week.
Yeah, because it's just like, on the one hand, it's like, yeah, what you're feeling is okay, but sometimes you want to take the practical approach of just removing the problem that's making you feel bad. Like, there are absolutely times for both approaches. And with regards to the empathy differences, that isn't something that's entirely made up, but it's been very biased because of how empathy has actually been measured in the literature over the years, because it's gone from being a more unilateral measure to measuring a lot of different kinds of aspects of it, like cognitive empathy, which is sort of clicking oh, person is feeling this way. Affective empathy is kind of more like feeling the same internal state. Personal distress, which is something that I and many other autistic people can attest to feeling to an intense degree when the empathy finally clicks. And then I think that there was another factor too, but I literally just found that study last night and was kind of skimming it in preparation for this. But the point is that oftentimes there are a lot of specific granular aspects of how it's been assessed, and trying to see it in the multidimensional model makes the deficits seem a lot less big by comparison than if you're using the more unilateral measures of empathy in the past, which is, I find fascinating. It shows that there are sort of gaps in the research that need to be filled in. And then you can find sort of more funny cases like, hey, did you know that autistic people are more likely to feel bad for objects? X and like stuffed animals and things? There's a paper about that too that is titled, "This paper will be sad if you don't read it." And I'm just thinking of this recent example when I was shopping with a friend of mine at the Joann's going out of business sale. And there were a bunch of tubes of this pretty aqua green color sitting on the clearance shelf like no one wanted them. And I felt so bad for them, and I just picked up one of them and put it in my cart. And it's just like, such a good color. I feel bad that no one wants it.
Oh, that's funny. That anthropomorphism, that was a word I learned when I was working with a bunch of chemical engineers and chemists when I was at SC Johnson. We were waiting for an interview one time, and we were talking, and they were very cerebral, smart people, and they talked about anthropomorphism, and that's where you attribute human or personal characteristics to an object.
Well, there's another new vocabulary word that Ingrid introduced me to, right, researching for this episode called, I'm not even sure I'm going to pronounce it correctly, alexithymia, difficulty identifying one's own emotions, something common for people that are neurodivergent.
You know, it's not just neurodivergent people that have that. A lot of people don't have self-awareness to how they show up. And I think in the interview setting, too, being able to articulate how you work, how you show up, how you think. And I love, Ingrid, that you did your Myers-Briggs. And so you can explain and educate an interviewer, here's who I am and here's how I show up. You know, and especially with someone who's neurodivergent, it's even harder because people haven't had as many experiences interacting with neurodivergent people.
So, and also it's just kind of harder in order to develop that emotional awareness, since the signals that neurodivergent people give off about their emotions do not match their internal states a lot of the time, since oftentimes I could be giving off a facial expression that people I'm not even actively aware of. So I can just kind of look all angry or whatever, when what really is happening is I am just super focused. Another reason for like alexithymia is like why that may be more common in neurodivergent folks is simply the fact that we often have to mask what we do feel in order to just get by in the everyday. So it's really easy to kind of just have that level of dissociation just as a fact of survival. And then there's like models of emotion that suggest that a lot of what we feel internally in our bodies and how we interpret that has to do a lot with our emotional states. And sometimes there can be a real difficulty with interoception, or feeling what you're feeling in your body. So that makes it difficult to sort of identify, oh, I'm feeling this, I'm feeling this, I'm feeling this. So there's a whole complexity of reasons for why it exists, but it's also not an insurmountable problem. We just need to be aware that it's there and that these discrepancies may exist, and then just be able to work from there. I certainly know that there have been cases where I was frustrated with a lot of my special ed or like IEP stuff when I was younger, because it didn't really felt like they were teaching me about the really useful stuff about the unwritten rules of like social interactions. It was all just like, we went through like these various like social scenarios or whatnot, but it's like what was going on behind the scenes wasn't always really explained to the detail that one would like. And I think being able to have more of a mindfulness of just how emotion is actually experienced on an internal level would help so very much.
So for me at work, I find that this discussion is making me think of how sometimes I can't always tell how something's being received, you know, depending on whether people are showing, their state of emotion or not. And sometimes the takeaway for me is, one-on-one, not in the middle of a meeting or with a group of people, but certainly one-on-one, sometimes checking in with someone after to go, hey, how did that work for you? Do you think you're going to be able to carry that out? What do you need in order to be successful carrying that out and, doing that extra step? I have a question for Deanne. When you've been doing the interview process, what are your tips for somebody who's a manager doing an interview who may have a neurodivergent candidate to help make that scenario work the best for everybody and make sure that you're really finding out what they're bringing to the table?
That's a really good question. I might flip it in a second to a little bit, but I think for me, getting to know you guys has helped me understand neurodivergency. And it also is much, there's a lot more articles. I read the Wall Street Journal. I run across a lot more information than I've ever had before about neurodivergent. And I think in the last 10 years, 15 years, we look at it very differently than we used to. But I would suggest that a lot of interviewers, managers aren't very familiar with it.
Right.
And so flipping the question, I don't know if some of the managers that you interview with are going to know what to ask. Now, I do think there's a parallel in that we need to educate the workplace managers, hiring managers, HR, much more on neurodivergency, because it allows us to tap a whole nother pool of talent that's really gone underutilized. And we're always looking for talent, and I think sometimes we don't recognize that there's a pool of talent here that's really amazing, that we're missing it because we don't know. So I think there's a parallel that we need to educate our HR people, our managers, our businesses about neurodivergency. At the same time, I think a lot of the burden is going to rest on the neurodivergent person themselves to show up at an interview and educate and use that as an opportunity. But I would suggest that I also educate when I'm in an interview I want people to understand how I show up. And if it's not going to work in that organization or work with that team, it's not going to be a good fit. So coming in and saying, here's how I like to work. Here's how I think. Here's how, if, for example, I'm an extrovert, if everybody on the team is introverted, I may not be successful with them necessarily. So figuring out, is there a fit culturally? Is there a fit? And again, to your point earlier, Pam, I think people need to be open to lots of different styles. Just having one type is not good. It limits creativity. But back to kind of flipping your question, I think it sits on the candidate to educate and to say, here's how I show up. Here's how I add value. Here's how I think about things. And as a neurodivergent person, you're going to realize it's different and address the elephant in the room. I'm neurodivergent. And here's how I think about it.
I will give the caveat that it may not always be best to lead with the neurodivergent label in a lot of cases, just because a lot of those misunderstandings and prejudice still exist. So you can sort of talk about a lot of the things about you that correlate with neurodivergent traits. Just mentioning that label outright may not always be the best way to go because that lack of education still exists. It's like, it's a good thought, definitely. It's just that going off of the practical experience, I know from many folks that it's just like, you unfortunately have to be considerate about how stuff like that ends up being perceived. Because it's like, we have acts where people are not allowed to discriminate against folks like that explicitly, but people will still find ways to get around that, even if, explicitly they can't do that in a legal sense. And I think that sort of segues into a point that you brought up when proposing this episode topic, Pam, is that it might be emotional intelligence might, for some, whether unconsciously or not, might be a roundabout way to discriminate against neurodivergent folks in the hiring process.
I did find an interesting list, and maybe Deanne, you have some inputs on that. There are, different traits and skills are, very necessary for certain roles, but certain traits or skills aren't necessary for every single role. And the list when I went to Copilot, because I'm playing around with AI a lot these days, I said, hey, which roles in the workplace really do need emotional intelligence? And the kinds of roles that came up were counselors and psychologists. Obviously, you need a high level of empathy and being able to read the room of what people are thinking. HR people like yourself, Deanne, because you're again working a lot with evaluating people. Teachers and educators. Interestingly, they said project managers, things like customer service, where you're really out there, a lot with people. But then also there were roles where they said emotional intelligence, Copilot, and I agree with Copilot here, is not as critical to being a high performer. If you're a data analyst or software developer, your code really doesn't care how you feel about things, or how well you can read the room. Things in the machinists, technicians, researchers, and I think of how wonderful Ingrid is in researching topics. I actually think if you're the more extroverted, I'm, whatever, that's sitting and deeply researching may not be as in your wheelhouse, right? And back-end engineers are QA testers. And I would say in my own organization, working with the Orleans Law Group, I have found that working in the legal arena, having people that are very, very cognizant of the rules and follow the rules very, very precisely is much more important than being emotionally intelligent.
Yes, especially when you have stuff like an audit breathing down your necks, where it's really important that you do these things in this very specific order. And I found that there's actually been another dimension just in how I do my work, and that my frustrations with the world as a neurodivergent person actually make me actively better at doing my job. I'm currently a software test environment manager. And oftentimes these environments can be very complex, so you sort of need to have a series of rules so people aren't just deploying changes at random times and causing cascade effects. You will find nobody on this planet who is more frustrated with arbitrary rules than neurodivergent folks. So me in this position, I can sort of be able to assess what rules make the most sense here. And then suddenly I am the person who is best suited to explain why these rules are there to a lot of teams who may not have been as familiar with it before, since it wasn't always as evenly enforced. It's just like, I understand this is a lot of extra things, but this is like traffic flow in the neighborhood. We have to make sure that somebody's not parking at the entrance of the cul-de-sac and keeping everyone else from getting in, unless there's like a tree down or a power line that things need to get fixed.
So Deanne, I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
I think, Ingrid, that it's kind of elusive when we talk about this emotional intelligence. I think some people are very empathetic and in tune to how others are feeling. And I think they have a very strong skill, like you said, a counselor or, a teacher, and some HR, roles that's required. At the same time, showing up more analytically and showing up doesn't mean that you don't have empathy. Actually, I would suggest I'm not the most empathetic person. I've been around people who you would traditionally say are empathetic. If you are crying, they will cry with you. They will absorb your pain. I will not do that, but I will go and try to find out who made you cry and fix it.
You'll make them cry.
I think this sort of addresses a misconception that you have to have the touchy feeling in order to feel compassionate for people, because it's like, yeah, that typically helps with it, but it's not strictly required. There are some folks that are neurodivergent folks that are more hypo-empathetic, but as a counter, it's been repeatedly shown in a lot of studies that autistic folks in particular tend to have a personal inner sense of fairness and justice that can often factor into the equations. Like, hey, granted, there is a legitimate cases where this can lead to some rigidity around things. It's also one thing I discovered recently that cohered with my experience is that there can be a sense of almost moral OCD around things. Typically, the term has been previously used as scrupulosity, though that's more specifically with like a religious slant to the OCD, but it absolutely is in the same kind of wheelhouse of constantly being worried about doing the wrong thing or whatnot. It's like, and I know that you found in like your own studies for your MBA that sometimes people being all touchy-feely about stuff that they donate to can lead them actively donating to things that don't really help the problem that they're trying to solve.
Oh, that's a really great point. I was on a board for Lutheran Social Services in Ohio, and it was interesting because there were a lot of other nonprofits that you had connections with through relationships, and some were run by people who had so much compassion and care and empathy, but they were not effective in what they did. And Lutheran Social Services was, they had the compassion, but they also had the operational discipline and the excellence to deliver, which I really enjoyed. But I saw a lot where people, again, you have to have the skills to do, to be all. And again, being compassionate and caring is a wonderful skill. But when you're running a large nonprofit, you've got to have some of that business, operational discipline that goes with that. And I think you said something else earlier. You were talking about how you show up. I think coming back to that interview process, you articulate very well how you think about things, how you consider others' feelings, and how you just don't maybe do it the same way someone else might, but understanding how and being able to articulate, here's how I problem solve, here's how I collaborate, here's how I would work with a difficult person. It might be very different than how I would, but it doesn't mean it's not going to be as successful.
Closing comments.
Well, first of all, Ingrid, I just applaud you for doing this work and helping to educate others. I do think we have a lot of more education that's needed. And I think enabling HR and business to tap into the talent pool and recognize that the contribution someone who's neurodivergent can make in an organization, even though you may not present quote unquote typically, understanding that there's a lot of value and a lot that can be contributed. And, I just applaud you for trying to educate people about that. And I think going back to kind of what I was saying earlier on the interview process, I still think a lot of it's going to rest in the person who's neurodivergent in their court right now. The reality is many of us in HR and business aren't very trained or understand. I would say I'm somewhat probably need a lot more than what I have, but thanks to you, I've had quite a bit of, but I'm still not completely knowledgeable. So as much as we need to develop on the business side, the neurodivergent candidate has an opportunity through that interview to educate and to understand how I can contribute and what value I can add. And, and like any interview, if it's not the right fit, it's not the right fit. But by talking about how you can contribute, who you are, how you approach things, that will educate an interviewer, regardless of whether you're neurodivergent or not. But you have an added task or tool in having to educate. And that's a burden, I agree, but I think it's one that you can do a lot and make a lot of impact by educating those interviewers, educating people in business.
Yeah, and me as a manager, I would say that, part of my takeaway, and I really appreciate your comments, Deanne, about like explaining how you show up, how you problem solve, et cetera, where us who are managing people or having interviews, what we could do is make sure that we make our staff feel confident and help them in explaining how they show up and getting more openness. One of the things we've talked about in a past episode is we can't disclose what the status of any of our employees are in terms of any disabilities. It is up to the individual to what they disclose, making people feel confident disclosing things that will help their coworkers understand them, work better together, more cohesively as a team. These are things that we can be doing as managers to make people feel confident in doing that and maybe give them some of the ways, help them in finding the ways to do that in the workplace.
And incidentally, this is a really good way to get more concrete answers to the common, so tell me about yourself, absolutely wide meadow of an interview question, since that was one of the most common ones to get stuck on. It's just like, okay, how do I show up at work? Sort of gives me a more concrete way to describe it in a way that basically gets across the important parts of the neurodivergent experience without ever having to explicitly use that word.
Right, right. And it's, I think anyone interviewing, regardless of who you are, letting the interview understand how you approach things, how you think about things. And when you are asked a question as a neurodivergent person, you can also throw in, here's an example of something I've done. Remember the STAR, the situation, task, action, result. You can incorporate also, here's how I approach it. Or I find, for example, you were talking earlier about your facial expression. Sometimes I have an expression and I have to remember that I'm maybe just really thinking. For me, I can get very loud when I'm passionate and almost sometimes I think intimidate people. And, do they feel like I'm yelling almost because I'm just so engaged? And saying it, here's what I watch in myself. I try to be cautious of that. You can incorporate that into those STAR answers, explaining a little bit more about how someone that's neurodivergent might approach that issue or that challenge.
Mm-hmm. And it's just, well, there may be some people, autistic people and other neurodivergent folks who have support needs high enough that it wouldn't be reasonable to expect them to work. On the other hand, it's just for the ones that really want to, it'd be really stupid if we're ignoring them just because they don't show up how we would typically expect. That ends up being a loss on both sides of things because things could be a lot better. And also, you can have them being able to have a life that they actually want to live. Because it's like, it's not just enough that people continue to exist, they actually have to have lives that want to give them something to look forward to day after day. That's something really important to just the whole mental health side of things. And being able to empower to be able to just be more open about that kind of stuff instead of constantly living in survival mode. I find that's something that can really help. It's something that I've certainly felt from a lot of my managers at my workplace, where it's just like, there could be like such a point where you're so focused on just trying to survive in the world that you forget to actually thrive. And this is one of those places where it's just like, I don't have to feel like I'm a misshapen piece of what people expect. I am a component that is elsewhere in the machine that helps everything run.
Yeah.
One of the things that I learned, I went through some really intense team building. And as an ENTJ, frankly, Pam and I are both ENTJs. It's a very tiny percent of women who are ENTJs. And it's a very large number of male CEOs who are ENTJs. And an ENTJ style or approach tends to not be as feminine or demure. And I grew up with the coach, well, like my family would even joke, oh, well, you talk a lot, or you always have an opinion about something. And it wasn't even just joking. Sometimes it felt hurtful. And I always thought I should be more demure. I should be different. I shouldn't be the one that is the center of attention and greeting people that I don't know and, talking to people. I've had friends like, oh gosh, why are you talking to that person? You don't know them. Like, because that's my personality. But I always thought I should be different. I read a book called Quiet, and it was about being an introvert in a world of extroverts. And I was reading it as an extrovert. And what I realized was whether you're introvert, extrovert, neurodivergent, male, female, however you show up, it's who you are and it's who you should be. And we should always coach ourselves and work to try to be better versions of ourselves, but not different versions of ourselves. And I think, you are a great version of yourself, Ingrid, and you need to be you, just like I need to be me. And need to love who we are. And again, work to be better, but not necessarily work to be different.
Yeah, I feel like it's the difference between you dig up a precious stone from the earth. And I feel like it's the difference between, I don't like this one, I'm going to try to find a different one, versus cutting and polishing the stone that you already have. I think that's sort of the metaphor I came up with to sort of explain the difference.
Well, that's a good one. That's a good one. And just realizing you are who you are and you are who you should be. You don't need to be someone different. I shouldn't be demure and quiet. And Pam, you're not going to be demure and quiet. You know,
no, I'm on the east side of ENTJ. I'm like 100% extroverted. Like I could not possibly be any more extroverted. And yes, there have always been those times when I'm like, why am I the loudest person in the room? But then I realized there's roles for everyone. And I'm also the one that's not afraid to charge into a new situation and sort it all out as a project manager. So if I didn't have that sort of take charge personality, I wouldn't thrive in these things that are like disorganized, not formed yet. So that's why everyone gives me the new things to do. But again, as manager, my job, this is reminding me, my job is to make my staff confident and others in the organization and be part of that education process of helping us learn how to have everybody thriving in the workplace. So,
yep. I am big on the introverted side of things, but I'm the sort of person who can spend a long time like looking at a lot of different books, looking at a lot of different articles to go into the precise weeds of something, since oftentimes there are a lot of details on the back end that people don't see that need to be accounted for. Like, one thing I recently had on my project is that we're trying to get an interface together that makes it easier for folks to see like what's happening when, but it's just like there's a lot of operational complexity on the back end, and we need to really refine that if we want to make that something we can do at scale. And it's just like it's really important to have both the initiative to sort of get these things started and also the initiative to keep them properly going and operational in the long term.
Absolutely.
So thank you, Deanne. Sorry.
We all bring different things to the workplace. And I think when we recognize that there's value in lots of different approaches and different styles and having that combination of things, it can be powerful.
Thank you for joining us today, Deanne. We really learned a lot from you, and we appreciate you sharing this journey where we're all continuing to learn and also try to educate others. So that we have a thriving professional workplace with opportunities for all.
Awesome. Well, thanks for the work you're doing.
Yes, thank you for joining us, and thank you, all of you viewers, for watching, commenting, and sharing stuff around. It really means a lot. It's just a small thing, but we can have the ripples hopefully go out a lot farther than we expected. So yeah, let's hope to see you next time.